Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. As we tape this, the United States Navy and the Pentagon were trying to figure out the fate of Captain Brett Crozier. 2 weeks after Crozier was fired by then acting Navy Secretary Tom Modly for his handling of the coronavirus outbreak on USS Theodore Roosevelt, the Navy leadership is recommending Crozier be reinstated to command. Modly has since resigned, but some of Washington's most thoughtful naval observers believe the episode has less to do with the coronavirus outbreak than broader Navy leadership problems. Joining us today are three sharp naval minds. Dr. Harlan Ullman is a retired United States Navy captain who commanded a swift boat during the Vietnam War and later a destroyer. He's now the chairman of two private companies, the Killowen Group and CNI Guard. He's also an advisor to some of Washington's leading think tanks. Bus Snodgrass is a retired United States Navy commander who commanded a fighter squadron while on active duty. He also served as former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis's communications director and chief speechwriter. He is now the CEO of Defense Analytics Consultancy, and he is the author of the book, Holding the Line Inside Trump's Pentagon with Secretary Mattis. And we're also joined by our very own Chris Cervello, a retired United States Navy commander and former public affairs officer. All three are Naval Academy graduates, and I should point out that Harlan's thoughtful piece on the need for naval leadership reform is on our website, as well as Bus Snodgrass's piece calling for Crozier's reinstatement. Before we get started, a shout out to our sponsors. Leonardo DRS sponsors our global coverage. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. Elbit Systems of America is one of our trade show sponsors, and Bell, of course, sponsors this podcast. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us.
You bet.
Delighted to be with you, Vago.
Thanks, Vago.
Chris, why don't you start us off with the state of play on this? I mean, this program was supposed to have happened on Monday, and every single day we've been a little bit on standby. Here we are on Friday afternoon taping this podcast, and we still don't have a resolution of this matter. Bring us up to speed on where we are.
Sure. As you mentioned, this is something that we first talked about 2 weeks ago, and then we've had several updates, and then we thought we would have this discussion about the resolution on Monday, and then it slid throughout the week. Before we jump into the discussion of Captain Crozier and the investigation, the latest information this morning on the sailors that are still dealing with the coronavirus on Theodore Roosevelt, there were 840 positive results of the roughly 5,000 sailors on board, about 900 positive, about 4,000 negative. 88 of the sailors that have tested positive have since recovered and are now testing negative. There are 5 or so sailors that are still in the hospital. Roughly 95% of the crew is ashore on board Naval Base Guam or in hotels in and around Naval Base Guam. The rest of the crew, they're tending to the 2 nuclear reactors. They're making sure that any of the weapons that would be for the air wing or for the ship's company are secure, and they're making sure that the ship is cleaned from top to bottom, from bow to stern.
And unfortunately, one of the sailors unfortunately passed away because of the disease. Talk to us a little bit about the state of play between the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Dr. Esper, and the Navy leadership about this, because there were several meetings that were to have happened with Secretary Esper and the CNO Admiral Gilday, and they didn't happen until Friday. Talk to us, give us a little bit of sort of the background on where we stand right now and what the delay is on making an ultimate decision.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. As we're talking, I got a statement from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, their public affairs folks. So I'll give you a quick update as to where we were, and then I'll read the statement to you and the listeners. Well, all week, as we said, we had been waiting for the Chief of Naval Operations to go and brief the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, on the findings of the investigation. It was reported late last week that the Navy had wrapped up their investigation and that the Chief of Naval Operations pretty well had a recommendation in mind and was going to take that up his chain of command. That creeped throughout the week as it was reported. Chief of Naval Operations couldn't get on the Secretary of Defense's schedule. Secretary of Defense was too busy, and that it would take to the end of the week for that to happen. That meeting occurred today, just before noon East Coast time, and then it was later reported, as you said in the opening, that the CNO had recommended reinstatement based on that investigation. We believed that there was going to be a press conference similar to the press conference that announced the firing of Captain Crozier, and then at the last minute, that press conference was pulled. It was never scheduled and was never executed. Then about an hour later, the New York Times, as I said, reported that the CNO was going to move ahead with reinstatement, sending the Pentagon Press Corps, sending OSD Public Affairs, and the Navy's Office of Information in a little bit of a spin. And so just now, the statement that came out attributed to Jonathan Hoffman, the Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, it reads, "This afternoon, Secretary Esper received a verbal update from the Acting Secretary of the Navy and Chief of Naval Operations on the Navy's preliminary inquiry into the COVID-19 outbreak on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. After the Secretary receives a written copy of the completed inquiry, he intends to thoroughly review the report and will meet again with Navy leadership to discuss next steps. He remains focused on and committed to restoring the full health of the crew and getting the ship at sea again soon." And so you can see there the parsing of the details is that it was only a verbal update, and that until a written copy is submitted and reviewed, no decision will move forward. So it keeps them from refuting essentially all of the major reporting outlets, but appears to get them out of making a decision until sometime in the future.
Harlan, let me go to you and what you think all of this means, because it would appear Jim McPherson obviously is now the acting Navy Secretary. He's also the Undersecretary of the United States Army, former naval officer, retired two-star, who was the Navy's Judge Advocate General, if I recall correctly. Harlan, talk to us about what's at stake here, because this was something that could have been a relatively easy win. Put a letter of admonishment in Captain Crozier's file saying, hey, you could have handled this situation better, ultimately reinstate him, and then that would have given the inertia, the momentum that folks expected. And in fact, you argued in your piece that appeared on our website and then subsequently on United Press International, where you have your column, weekly column, to give Admiral Gilday an opportunity to hit the reset button and address some of the leadership challenges. From your standpoint, what do you think of where we are and how this fits into your broader case for a top-to-bottom reform of naval leadership?
The TR incident really cast a huge question on the whole chain of command. Acting Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Modly, did not believe he was getting the right response from the chain of command in his discussions with the Chief of Naval Operations. And so he took it upon himself to go directly to the captain, as did his Chief of Staff. Clearly, from the Theodore Roosevelt's perspective, the captain knew that the battle group commander, Stuart Baker, was only a few paces away, yet something was wrong, since he felt that he had to write a letter and send it to the chain of command, because I believe he felt the chain of command was not supporting him. So from the top to the bottom, there's a huge question here that raises, it seems to me, fundamental questions about the Navy, and also gets into the litany of scandals and mishaps that date back to Fat Leonard, the Glen Marine scandals, when this ship's chandler in the Pacific was, by bribes of money, wine, women, and meals, corrupting many naval officers to be able to exact high-priced contracts. And in the aftermath, the moral and ethical compasses of the Navy were held in question, as many officers were fired or reprimanded or professionally ruined by this lapse. But on top of that, the two collisions of USS John McCain and the Fitzgerald, the firing, or I should say the abrupt resignation of Admiral Bill Moran, CNO, who had been already confirmed by the Senate, the firing of the president of the Naval War College, who had been extended for a year because of performance of duty, the failures to onboard the Gerald Ford carrier in terms of cost overruns, system delays, system problems with the F-35 with the Columbia class, and the firing of First Secretary of the Navy, Richard Spencer, over the Chief Gallagher business. All these and other issues, it seems to me, cast fundamental questions over the leadership, over the culture, over the institutions, over the bureaucracy, and the way that the Navy operates at sea and in port. Since the days of George Washington, every service has had its scandals and mishaps. But today, the frequency and number of these occurrences for the Navy suggests to me, as Admiral Beatty said at the Battle of Jutland in May of 1916, when his battle cruisers were exploding, something is bloody wrong with our ships today. And I think the Navy needs a top-to-bottom review, a very intensive review of all of its procedures and how it operates, on what it's doing right and what it's doing wrong. And I also believe, as with the collision investigation of McCain and Fitzgerald, the only way you're going to get to the bottom of this is with an outside panel of very, very tough-minded former military officers and civilians who are prepared to ask and answer tough questions. I think the Navy has a world of problems. There are a lot of reasons for it that have to deal with the many problems the Defense Department has had, from sequestration to huge demands on the operating forces for the last 20 years. The fact that it's been very difficult to be able to get our procurement programs out on time and at the proper cost. But I think this is the time for a fundamental review. And the last time a fundamental review took place of the Navy was in 1970, when Admiral Bud Zumwalt became Chief of Naval Operations. Zumwalt was frightened that if there were a war, the US Navy would not be able to defeat the Soviets. He felt the Navy was lagging in technology. He was also fearful of a mutiny because of all the problems we're having over Vietnam with blacks and minorities. And so he put in place Project 60. I'm not suggesting the Navy is in a similar condition to then, but I am suggesting is that there are just too many symptoms of ill health. It needs a rigorous examination. And I hope that Admiral Gilday, who is untainted by all these scandals, will be prepared to have both an internal and an external review that can get to some of the bottom of these fundamental issues.
Let me ask, I want to go to Bus and to Chris in a second, but I just want to ask a follow-up, Harlan. You're class of 1963 at the Naval Academy. Yeah, that means that you went in as a plebe in 1959. You have more experience seeing the Navy and being familiar with its leadership. You were good friends with Admiral Zumwalt. If I recall correctly, you were also on his staff. Talk to us a little bit about what you think the nature of the leadership problem is, because unless you define it, you can't address it. Each one of these incidents have kernels and elements that illustrate the leadership challenges and failures and problems. From your standpoint, what is the source of those problems?
I also room with former CNO and Chairman Tom Moore at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Well, after Tom was retired, we shared a suite. And I'm old enough and knew, actually, Admiral Arleigh Burke. The admirals that I knew were all World War II experienced and Korean War experienced. The US Navy has not been at war as a big Navy since Okinawa in 1945. That didn't mean that pilots, submariners, obviously Marine Special Forces, guys like us in the brown water navies didn't see combat. But the last time the Navy lost a ship to enemy action was Pueblo in 1968. So over time, the leadership has become, I think, much more acclimated to what I would call non-combat operations, even though these operations are themselves very, very demanding. And as a result of that and many other issues, we've developed a no defect mentality. I'll give you an example. As you know, for 2 years, I was a visiting professor and distinguished fellow at the Naval War College, which was part-time. But in that process, I had a chance to meet and talk with a lot of relatively junior officers. And in the case of the surface Navy, believe it or not, ships were having inspections on the rate of about 1 a day or 300 a year. And for some reason, refresher training that we knew, which was very demanding, had been changed by the Navy for a number of reasons. But if you were Captain Vago in one ship and you did well in 295 of the 300 inspections, and Captain Ullman did well in 280 of the 300 inspections, you know who would be number one and number two. The point is that not all those inspections were of equal value. And so as a result, the prioritization of combat readiness, the ability to fight, to look after your crew, and indeed to tell the truth in every case became, I think, somewhat demeaned. And as a fact, look what happened with the skipper of the guided missile ship Decatur, who was relieved because he failed to report his position when he stopped to make repairs to one of his engines. But the system, I think, probably made him do that. So the zero defect mentality has really eroded risk-taking. Bud Zumwalt for all his strengths, was one of the most courageous people I've ever met. I don't think Bud Zumwalt would have been promoted to lieutenant commander in today's Navy simply because of the zero defect mentality and the fact that to get along is to go along. And I have seen too many commanding officers who really just wanted to get through their commands and go on to the next assignment. Now, this is not all a result of the lack of the Navy not being at war for a big Navy, but it is a result of all sorts of bureaucratic, cultural, and institutional pressures that have been allowed to persist, and nobody has really cut them back. And that's why I think a deep look is required to take a look at how we educate and train. As you know, I was on the Education for Sea Power review study for the Secretary of the Navy, along with former Chairman Mike Mullen, Marine General John Allen, Secretary of the Air Force Barbara Barrett, and Vice Admiral retired Ann Rondo. And one of the things we determined in this particular effort, which unfortunately did not see as much of it should have seen because of the actions of the then CNO, the Navy had no strategy for education. In fact, in many ways, aside from the technical areas, the Navy could be seen as anti-intellectual because going to war colleges with something that you could do, but you didn't have to do, even though for the other three services, a junior and senior war college were mandatory for promotion. So I think all these issues suggest to me that there has to be a really tough look at leadership, at culture, at institutions, at how the Navy operates at sea and ashore to see what's going right and what's not, and how we can correct this zero defect mentality and award greater risk-taking. It's very interesting that recently a study of what the Strategic Studies Group did at Newport under a series of CNOs going back to before Admiral Kelso and to before Admiral Kelso, and the number of ideas that came out over the course of 20 or 25 years were really dramatic, but very few of them reached fruition simply because the bureaucracy managed to kill innovation. And so I think how we look at innovation and imagination requires a top to bottom review as well, because I'm afraid we're just not getting the most out of our people at a time when one of the consequences of COVID-19 has to be a reduction, and probably a sharp reduction in defense spending, simply because the size of the deficit and debt are going to go up dramatically.
Bus, let me bring you into the conversation, and thanks very much for that, Harlan. I thought that was a very comprehensive take. Bus, from your standpoint, as somebody, you were a Japan-based commanding officer, talk to us a little bit about how you regard where we are now, and what are the next steps, because you could easily say that there was an easy opportunity for a win-win for everybody, and then an ability for the CNO to be able to hit that reset button and move forward. And yet we're losing that momentum. Talk to us about where you stand on this.
Sure. Thanks, Vago. So as you mentioned, there's a couple interesting aspects. First, before I get to answering your question, I would like to say I agree almost throughout everything Harlan said. I think he's touched on a number of issues, the need for a deep dive review, an independent review into the internals of the U.S. Navy, specifically senior leadership. It reminds me of an award-winning article that was published by the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings by a young lieutenant named Daniel Stephanus called "There's Rot in Our Hulls." And he was advocating the same thing. Back in 2014, I had authored a white paper called "Keep a Weather Eye on the Horizon," which took a hard look at Navy officer retention across a number of unrestricted line elements within the Navy, where you saw just some of the most talented men and women jumping at their first opportunity to get out of the Navy. And that's not the hallmark of an award-winning institution. And so, to Harlan's point, I think that strikes at there's a deeper systemic cultural issue within the Navy with how it not only acquires, but trains and retains talent as it moves forward. So when you say, what do we need to do as we move forward? I am a little perplexed at how this played out this week with, as Chris mentioned at the top of the podcast, we expected a fairly rapid response from Navy leadership to adjudicate whether or not Captain Brett Crozier stayed within the proper communication channels as he communicated his concerns uphill to leadership. I think so far everything we've at least seen publicly would indicate that yes, he did. And so this all seemed to be laying out perfectly for not only Secretary of Defense Esper, but then subsequently President Trump to basically claim victory. and say this was a errant action by former acting Secretary of the Navy Modly. He acted in haste, did not have all the facts, responded with emotion. And of course, as we know, emotion is the enemy of good judgment. So there was a really nicely wrapped together way that the Navy could have claimed victory and all the way up through the White House. So far, that hasn't happened. And I'm not sure why, because as Chris mentioned, the further you get along from it, the less likely it seems that it might be for Captain Crozier to be reinstated, despite the fact that's what Navy leadership has now offered to the Secretary of Defense. So where do we go from here? I think that ultimately I would still, my position hasn't changed. I would advocate vocally and vigorously for the reinstatement of Captain Crozier. I think it solves a lot of Navy's immediate concerns in a very succinct way. The way you choreograph moves into positions of leadership for nuclear powered aircraft carriers is incredibly, it's detailed very closely. There's a lot of timing involved, so this makes that easier. The current acting commanding officer, who was the prior commanding officer, Captain Sardiello, could now go back to his normal. So there's a lot of just tactical moves that would make sense, but strategically, this gets back to restoring Captain Crozier would heal the widespread sense of a loss of faith and confidence in senior leadership that is being felt throughout the force, not only by rank and file sailors, but more importantly by the men and women in command. And I've heard this from various regions throughout the world, from actively serving 05 and 06. That's your commander and captain level commanding officers saying, hang on a second, 2017, just like Harlan mentioned, you had collisions with the USS McCain and the USS Fitzgerald where 17 sailors lost their lives. And the way the Navy kind of hung responsibility was to say those two commanding officers were not strident enough. They didn't have enough courage to raise their hand and say, we cannot proceed on mission because we are under-resourced and we are not in a position to do so. And if you recall, then in December of 2017, the then CNO, John Richardson, had gone before Congress, before the Senate Armed Service Committee, and said, I need commanding officers willing to have the courage to say no when it's appropriate. And if I had one of those, I would go down to the waterfront right now and pin a medal on their chest. And I think that's what makes this moment in time so critical for Admiral Gilday, for Acting Secretary Jim McPherson. It's their opportunity to say that message that Admiral Richardson sent in 2017 was the right one. Captain Crozier acted honorably. He acted within the lifelines of the chain of command. He took the right actions, and he should not have been relieved, and we're going to restore him. And in doing so, you would certainly help to heal the rift that has become even wider between commanding officers and the very senior admirals and senior executive service members that lead the Navy. But I think more importantly, you would also begin to heal the wider rift that Harlan previously pointed out that's existed because just of the last 3 to 5 years of scandal and very difficult highlighted issues that have occurred with the U.S. Navy.
Plus, I would also point out that both the CNO as well as Tom Modly at the time complimented Crozier for putting his hand up. And I can't remember which one of them said, hey, this is what we told him to do, which is put your hand up and ask for help if you need it. And that's what he's done, which is the reason why we understand the CNO in the deliberation with Secretary Modly that did get very, very heated, made the case, we don't have to do anything now. Let's wait for the investigation to come back in before we do anything else. Harlan, I think you want to add a point before we go over to Chris. Go ahead.
I don't want to get engaged in whether or not to reinstore the captain of Theodore Roosevelt because I don't have enough of the facts and understanding. I want to repeat, there had to be something wrong with the chain of command. What was the battle group commander doing? What was the 7th Fleet commander doing? What was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet doing about all this? Until we understand that, I think it's very difficult to determine what should happen next, and I hope that the investigation does that. One of the most stunning events that I did not mention was the fact that for over 2 years, the law of the land and the Defense Authorization Act mandates a 355-ship Navy. Whether that's good or bad, it's still the law of the land, and that for 2 years, the Navy was not able to come up with a plan for 355 ships. That the Secretary of Defense had to take over the responsibility for designing the future Navy strikes me as the harshest indictment of the Navy that anybody could make. In fact, the last time I can think of any such indictment was way back when Bob Gates fired the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of the Air Staff because of a nuclear mishap that had occurred. And so I think that the Navy not able to define what its future was, to me, is the most stunning evidence, the fact that something is not right and that something needs to be fixed.
Chris, you were you still are at heart a professional public affairs officer. How do you think all of this has played out? What are the implications? And do you think that this ultimately becomes an impediment for Navy leaders to be able to act?
Yeah, I do think it is and will continue to be an impediment for Navy leaders to act. Both Harlan and Buss and your guest on this weekend's podcast, the strategy podcast that you'll air on Saturday, Admiral Swift, have identified really the core of the problem, and that's an erosion of trust. And the only thing I would add is that from my perch before I left the Navy, it was obvious that there was an erosion of trust up and down the chain of command because of the missteps that Harlan captured and because of the concerns that Buss articulated. You have sailors looking up, asking a lot of questions. You have leaders maybe looking too far down, trying to get involved in issues that perhaps they shouldn't be involved in. And I would say that I think to Harlan's point about the 355 ship Navy and the Secretary of Defense having to weigh in, I think it's brought questions of trust from senior leaders in the Pentagon and on the Joint Staff. And that's a tough place to be in for the Chief of Naval Operations. It's a tough place to be in for the Pacific Fleet Commander and for the other 4 stars that run the Navy. As you mentioned, and as we've talked a couple times on podcasts about this issue, this was an opportunity for Admiral Gilday to not only look to heal the Navy, as Harlan wrote in his piece, but I think it was even more tactically how this issue was handled, how it was announced, and how he used the words and the actions that he came to as a result of that investigation, I think was going to be very important to him in terms of trying to regain some of that trust with sailors and commanding officers in the fleet, and to almost, shake the Etch-a-Sketch, if you will, on what was a pretty vanilla first 6 months as Chief of Naval Operations. I hope that all of that opportunity is not gone, but I do fear, given how this has played out over the last week, that sort of the meat of that opportunity is now in his wake, and he'll have to look for other ways to find that trust and that restart that he needs to be able to do some of the bigger things that Harlan and Buss just talked about.
And isn't there a manifest absurdity that the President of the United States is getting involved in an 06 planning decision, an 06 career decision at the end of the day? I mean, isn't that what this delay really is predicated on?
Vago, you raised a critical point here that we haven't discussed, and that's the role of the Commander-in-Chief. Donald Trump is unique in the sense that he has really intervened more in the Department of Defense. If you go back and read Buss's book in the July 2017 first meeting at the Pentagon, when he accuses the senior military of being babies and stupid, he's intervened. He's intervened with Eddie Gallagher. He said he was going to intervene here. He's fired Richard Spencer. And so if you are the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States has said he has an interest in this case, it seems to me you would be derelict if you were not concerned how the White House was going to react. Now, what the consequences of Commander-in-Chief interference at every level will be remain to be seen. People accuse the Obama administration of having the 3,000-mile screwdriver. I think that goes back to Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War. But the fact is that civil-military relations have been greatly influenced by this Commander-in-Chief, for good or for ill. And that will play out over time, but they are not insignificant, and I think you're correct. I think that Secretary of Defense wants to get some guidance for the White House, and quite frankly, I don't blame him. And so I think that is probably the prime reason why there has not been immediate action on this particular event.
Well, I just want to jump in real quick and say I agree with
course.
what Harlan just said. I saw this from the front office serving with Secretary Mattis. I mean, you'd be foolish, not only in any administration, but certainly in this administration, to get out in front of your boss, in this case, President Trump. So having that kind of alignment with the White House, finding the time to get an audience, or at least get an audience with the right individuals during the time of coronavirus, I'm sure is challenging. I did want to cover down on one thing. I think it got unfairly attributed to me with the book. The moment in time that Harlan just referenced is actually from a book that was written by two Washington Post reporters, Pulitzer Prize winning reporters. And the unfortunate aspect of the days that we live in is that he's right. I was at that meeting. I ran that meeting, but that quote's false. I've seen it it's printed and talked about so often that Trump, during a meeting in July of 2017, had called the military, dopes and babies, and wouldn't want to go to war. That never happened. So I'm hoping at some point that gets cleared up by those two authors, as they have been rewarded in the past for their spot on reporting. And it's unfortunate that there's that kind of misinformation, because you've got some really, really smart people who are now taking that up, like Max Boot and others, and repeating it as if it's true. The meeting, though, that I think is very telling to me, and this gets to points that both Chris and Harlan made, was the second time we hosted President Trump at the Pentagon. This is another meeting that I had put together and run for Secretary Mattis, and this was in the January 2018 timeframe. It was originally detailed to brief him on the 2018 National Defense Strategy, but as part of that discussion, Secretary Mattis had pulled in the members of the Joint Chiefs, and President Trump at the very end had asked each member of the Joint Chiefs what their number one pressing concern was. And they kind of went around the room, and the answer that I really appreciated was the one that then Chief of Naval Operations John Richardson gave, when he said his number one concern was retention. And like I mentioned previously, because of the 2014 Navy retention study and the white paper on retention, this is an area that I personally have a lot of concern about, because the way Admiral Richardson stated it is correct. He said it's a one-way check valve. You can assess your sailors, they can rise to the ranks, but when they leave, they take that talent with them, and you can't directly assess, or it's very difficult to directly assess, especially to the warfighting communities, senior level talent. There's no mechanism to make that happen. So his concern is that he goes, look, I've seen the data, and it's very telling that your most talented sailors, generally speaking, are the ones that leave at their first opportunity. And then the second tranche is when they hit 20 years and they punch out to go to greener pastures. And so that's something that, to hear the Chief of Naval Operations make that kind of admission to the Commander in Chief, I thought was very telling. And this gets back, it's underpinned by what Chris said. That was a key takeaway from the 2014 Navy retention study, was the fact that it wasn't just quality of service and quality of life that sailors have cared about. They really cared deeply about the quality of leadership that they observed and the quality of leaders that they have the opportunity to serve with. And you can see a direct correlation when you work with top-notch leaders who care deeply about their people and are very talented. Those that they lead are much likely to stay in the Navy. When you work with someone who is far less talented, or more junior people look up and say, this person doesn't belong in that senior of a role, that's when you start seeing people heading for the exits pretty quick. So just a comment to circle back around and say, I do once again agree with what Harlan has said overall. This is a great opportunity after so many large, very public data points have been laid out over the last 3 to 5 years. It's a great opportunity for that independent panel to take a very hard, unvarnished look, so that senior leaders can be given the information that they need to hear, not just what the information they want to hear.
Chris, give us your sense.
I just wanted to foot stomp very briefly on what Bus just said, because there's a lot of people that will say and have said over time, hey, look, you don't have to worry about talent leaving when the economy is in trouble. And actually, I think Bus in his study, and certainly during my time working for the Chief of Naval Personnel, we found that that wasn't true. In fact, your best and brightest will leave no matter what the economic conditions are. So as the Navy looks at the issues that Harlan raised, and as they consider it in the context of keeping talent, I don't want people to think that it gets any easier simply because of the unemployment rate that we're likely to see after COVID-19. We still want to make sure that the folks that we keep in are the people that are going to best prepare the Navy and best prepare the military for the challenges that they're going to face in the 2020s.
I have a broader question of all of you as a last question before we part, because I think we could have an hour longer on this. And unfortunately, we're already a little bit over time. I have been writing about this challenge for a long time, longer than I'd like to have been reporting about this challenge, and in the sense that some of the best and brightest in the Navy were looking at their leaders as emperors without any clothes. how is it, and I know that CNOs have thought this through. I know this was an issue that Admiral Greener spent a lot of time thinking about. I know that this was an issue that Admiral Richardson would think about, and certainly thought about before he became CNO, that there was a cultural problem in the Navy, a cultural leadership problem in the Navy. I know that was something that Bill Moran spent a lot of time thinking about, and in fact was going to devote his tenure and term to before it was interrupted. I know Gary Roughhead would think and talk about this. Why is it that we have known that this is a problem for as long as we've known it, and nothing has happened to address it? Harlan?
First of all, it takes a crisis generally to force any sort of major change. Pearl Harbor was probably the greatest crisis. When you take a look how the Navy performed during 1942, and quite frankly, the Japanese really bloodied killed a lot of American sailors because we weren't ready. This is a warning. We have some problems, but on the other hand, and this should be a sign of optimism, we still have an awful lot of really good people and really good systems. And so the issue here is in fact leadership. How do you take an organization, determine what it's doing right and what it's not doing correctly, and making sure we can fix it? That takes an enormous amount of intellectual courage because you've got to make change. And one thing a bureaucracy is brilliant at doing is resisting change. And I'm not, it's evil, but when you put in place bureaucracies that are staffed with thousands of people and billions of dollars, moving that is far more difficult than having an aircraft carrier change course. So what's going to be required is intellectual courage of the highest standard, to know what needs to be done, to make sure it is done, and then to follow up. One of the strengths of Bud Zumwalt's Project 60 was that Bud had a so-called green stripe room where he had a bright lieutenant or a lieutenant commander following up the very, very next day to make sure that this was not lost in the paper trail. The one area where Bud would admit he fell short was in communications. With all the changes that Bud was making, he failed to inform all of his prospective commanding officers so that when they went to sea in their ships, submarines, and aircraft squadrons, they knew what the Chief of Naval Operations wanted. I hope Admiral Gilday, when he takes this on, will make sure that his communications from seniors to juniors is far better. There's a very telling story, and I think you were there, Vago. Last August, I was addressing about 150 people on Project 60 at the Navy Marine Corps Memorial. Mm-hmm. And there were 3 or 4 3-stars there. And then I was asked what was one of the shortcomings of Zumwalt's Project 60, and I said communications. And I turned to one of the 3-stars who said, no, we've really got that going. And with that, at the far end of the hallway, a young ensign was raising his hand. And I said, what would you like to say? He said, well, I graduated from the Naval Academy a year ago. I'm supposed to go to flight school. But during that year, I was detached to go out and see how well or badly communications were. It is simply not happening. Well, you had an ensign, and everybody knew he was telling the truth. And here you had a very, very able, capable flag officer who thought he was telling the truth. That was the gap. So whatever needs to be done, there has to be far better communications from top to bottom and bottom to top.
Boss?
So I think number one, and this gets a little bit to what Harlan was also saying, which is just a thoughtful and deliberate design process, taking a very hard look, as Harlan has advocated for, at where we stand now, and then much like any strategy development, forecasting into the future, what you want your Navy to look like, the qualities and characteristics that it needs to champion, and then making sure that those processes and procedures are in place to support it. And I think the only way you get there is you need a full spectrum of individuals that participate. You need recently retired individuals who have seen senior enough levels, but who can speak to some of the perils and pitfalls. You need junior personnel who frankly are far more willing to speak truth to power, but sometimes lack the historical perspective of why things are the way they are. And of course, very senior leaders or external leaders who can take a look at the entire surface of the water. And I think one of the biggest impediments that the Navy faces, And this gets a little bit to what Harlan said at the beginning of the podcast about a peacetime Navy. And that is, there's a law I'd run across when I was doing the first Navy retention study called Parkinson's Law. And essentially it just shows you that over time, every organization is almost internally incentivized to grow its administrative function. And the unfortunate aspect of that is as you add more bodies, more functions, more things that take you further and further from your core focus of warfighting, it generates its own administrative burden. And then, of course, that administrative burden, it's almost like an exponentially building distractor. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, as I'm sure Chris and possibly Harlan can as well, that senior leaders want to do the very best in the job. They feel that they are representing, of course, their service, that they want to do the very best for the men and women they lead. They want to represent well to the American public and to show the absolute return on investment from American taxpayer dollars. There's no doubt. But because of all these distractions, because of all the sheer amount of paperwork and everything else that goes into their day. I mean, when I worked for both Admiral Greenert and Secretary Mattis, you would watch as their calendar began sometimes 6:30 in the morning and would run all the way through to 7 or sometimes even 8 p.m. at night for a social function. And then you wash, rinse, repeat the next day. And it's very hard for leaders in that kind of a position who have very little time already built into their schedule to have any kind of reflective time or deep thinking time to really not only consider the wide-ranging issues that are affecting their service, but how they can put processes or the right individuals in place to help solve those. So I think that that's going to be a very challenging. It's very easy for the four of us to say, take a hard look and then move out. It's much more difficult to actually do that in practice. But I think that the promise and the peril couldn't be more stark for the Navy right now, because the reality is actions always speak louder than words ever can. And you got to have the actions that line up behind what Admiral Gilday and Acting Secretary McPherson want to do as they move forward for the next months, let alone years.
Chris?
Yeah, I'll finish with this, Vago, and just try to tie the 2 points that I thought Harlan and Bus really made well there in their last statements. Harlan is exactly right. The Navy is filled from the top to the bottom with really good people that care a great deal. And I was lucky enough to see that for 20 years. Both Harlan and Bus are right that the Navy does need to do a better job of communicating up and down as well as out to the American people, especially after incidents like this. I worked for Admiral Bill Moran. I worked for him when he was the Chief of Naval Personnel. And he used to talk about in everything we say and do, especially at the Bureau, because we touch so many people's lives, that had to convey trust, balance, and stability. Those were the 3 kind of principles in which he lived by and all the decisions that he made. And he really worked hard to make sure that the staff understood that. I'm hopeful that if Admiral Gilday, as he attacks the initial problem of better communicating his decision and hopefully taking what's left of the opportunity with the decision on Captain Crozier, as well as a larger look at the Navy, if there's anything that he can take from Admiral Moran, it's that idea of trust, balance, and stability, because I think that those 3 principles will go very far in helping to at least begin to heal the trust that has eroded up and down the chain, so that when the larger muscle movements are needed, that trust is the foundation that they can build that change on.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for all your time, all your insights. Really, really appreciate it. We all agree that there's a lot of work to be done. And, it kind of goes back to a problem that I think we've discussed on these podcasts, and we amongst us all have had this conversation, that too often the Navy's answer to things has been, well, as long as we fire the person and we get rid of them, we're protecting the institution, not quite recognizing that some of the mistakes people are making are a reflection of the institution. And the fact that we've never been dealing with them, you'll run out of people to fire before you get to the heart of some of the changes that are needed. Really appreciate it. Want to have you guys back on again to continue to discuss this very, very important topic. Thanks again. Stay well and talk soon.
Thanks, Vago.
Thanks, Vago.
And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. Look for our weekly cyber reports sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight, bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.